Small, lightweight, sharp, and super fast autofocus. Sounds like a dream lens, right? Yet, when I look at Nikon's amazing lens lineup, I cannot help but wonder, are there better and more flexible options available in this range? So let's take a look and see if this lens blew me away in the field or if my initial concerns were warranted. The first thing that stands out about this lens is the super small size, at least for a 400mm lens, and the weight, weighing in at just 1.2 kilos or 2.7 pounds. I used the lens in combination with the Z8 and that combo sat perfectly in my hand and I could effortlessly hold it all day long. Unlike a lot of other telephoto lenses where your hands have to sit quite far forward to actually be able to balance and hold the lens properly, with this lens and camera combo, everything is nice and close to your face, allowing you a nice and sturdy hold and also allowing you to hold the lens without having too much trouble. When I was field testing a brand new firmware 2.0 for the Nikon Z8 before it was actually released, I had planned to do a lot of birds and flight and action photography. And for that I went to a local Ibis and Ebook rookery. And if you've never been to one of these rookeries, the sounds and smells are simply mind-blowing. But back to the lenses. I had initially planned to use the 600mm PF lens and the 180 to 600mm lens for birds and flight shooting, but it got dark on me really quickly and I struggled to get any sort of reasonable shutter speed above like a thousandth of a second. And even to get to that thousandth of a second, I already had to dial in like ISO 12,800, so definitely not ideal. So I remembered I had a third lens in my backpack that actually had an f-stop of f4.5. So I grabbed the 400mm f4.5 lens and put it on the Z8. And having the ability to just open that lens up a little bit more allowed me to finally get just enough shutter speed so I was able to continue my birds and flight test. And during these tests, the lens definitely shined and in this case at least outperformed the 600mm and the 180 to 600mm lenses simply because I could open the aperture up a bit more that allowed me to have those faster shutter speeds. What I find quite interesting as well, that even though it's such a small size, the 4.5 400mm lens is actually not one of Nikon's PF lenses like the 600 and 800mm lens. It's a normal S-line lens with a 95mm front element. If you've been following my channel for a while, you will know that I'm a big advocate of stopping down to get increased sharpness and more depth of field in my photos. However, I definitely appreciate the ability to open up a lens in dark conditions or when I want to have a really smooth background. So in that regard, the 4.5 400mm lens definitely shined and stood out compared to like a 100 to 400mm lens, 180 to 600mm lens, or the 600mm f6.3 lens, because most of these lenses are either limited to 5.6 or 6.3 wide open. So this lens is definitely quite unique in the market. If you want a faster f-stop lens, you basically have to go to a huge f2.8 400mm lens, or if you want something slightly faster like a Canon f4 400mm DO lens, you'll have to have a much heavier lens and also pay a lot more. So in that regard, at that $3,000 price point in this small size with a still 4.5 f-stop, the lens is super unique and very attractive. As I said at the beginning of this video, I wasn't too sure about this lens initially and how it fits into the Nikon lineup, but when I started to use it more in the field for birds of flight and action photography, especially in darker conditions, it started to make a lot more sense for me, because there the lens really shined and the autofocus stood out to me especially. It was nice and fast, found the subject with ease, and also tracked them very nicely. Whenever I review Nikon lenses and cameras, I'm always impressed how well the IBIS and the image stabilization work together and how stable the lenses are, especially for video. And this lens is no exception. Without too much effort, you can do handheld video and also shoot at slow shutter speed, so that definitely makes the lens quite appealing and versatile to me. One downside of this lens compared to a 100 to 400mm lens, for instance, is definitely the minimum focusing distance of 2.5 meters or 8.2 feet. With the 100 to 400mm lens, you can get really close to your subject and shoot within that 1 meter. So even if the animals come really close to you, you can still get some really nice images. Whereas with the 400mm prime lens, you're definitely more restricted and have to stand back a lot further. And sometimes you actually have to walk away from your subject because they kind of walk within your minimum focusing distance. So 2.5 meters minimum focusing distance is definitely not a deal breaker, but for a 400mm lens, it would sometimes also be nice if you were able to get a bit closer to your subject, especially if you also wanted to use it as like an emergency macro lens. And in that case, the 100 to 400mm lens with a smaller minimum focusing distance has definitely a great advantage. And no matter whether you're using a teleconverter or no teleconverter or Sony, Nikon or Canon, One area where you could improve your photography dramatically is image editing, and I would love to help you with that with my masterclass, my PROSETS, and my brush pack. With my PROSETS, I allow you with just one click to get amazing results out of your RAW files, and in my masterclass I teach you step by step everything you need in Photoshop to get amazing results, and with my brush pack I make your life in Photoshop just a little bit easier. So if that's of interest to you and you want to get better when it comes to image editing and more confident, make sure to check these out down there in the description. Part of my concern with this lens initially, and pretty much all 400mm prime lenses in general, is that for bird photography in particular, 400mm is not a lot of focal length and in many cases is a little bit too short. For larger mammals, sports, or maybe an African safari, 400mm can be quite adequate, but when it comes to bird photography, a lot of times the subject will still be very small in your frame at 400mm unless you can get really close to your bird. If 400mm is all the focal length you need, then this lens is pretty much a no-brainer. But if you need that bit of extra reach, things get a little bit more tricky because then you have to add a teleconverter to the lens. And while teleconverters still work quite well on this lens, they do add a little bit of extra weight, extra cost, and they degrade image quality, autofocus, and image stabilization a little bit. Now, of course, this happens on every lens if you add a teleconverter, and you can still take amazing images with a lot of lenses and teleconverters, including the 4.5 400mm lens. But at the same time, if I have the choice between using a teleconverter and not using a teleconverter, I would always opt for not using one. So if you know that 400mm will be often too short for you and you plan to use the 4.5 400mm lens with a 1.4 extender most of the time, I think it might be time to actually look at a slightly longer lens, something like the 600mm PF lens. That's also super nice and lightweight, not too much bigger than the 400mm lens, and gives you 600mm of reach with amazingly fast autofocus and fantastic image stabilization. And on top of that, you could also add the 1.4 extender to the 600mm lens, giving you 840mm. Now you could add the 2x teleconverter to the 400mm lens and get to 800mm wide open at f9, but this is really now something that I wouldn't recommend using on a regular basis and would only really use that in an emergency situation, but it's not really something that I would recommend for people to use. And if you know that you need these longer focal length, a 600mm or even an 800mm PF lens for instance, are probably a better choice. When we add teleconverters to our lenses, we not only degrade image quality and autofocus a little bit, but also image stabilization. Because image stabilization is calculated for the lens without any teleconverters. So adding teleconverters to our lens definitely decreases the effectiveness of the image stabilization as well. One question I always ask people looking for a lens in that sort of 400mm range is, how much do you value flexibility? Because with a 400mm prime lens, you get amazing 400mm, but that's kind of all you get at the same time. So when it comes to flexibility, something like Nikon's great 100 to 400mm lens definitely has an edge because you still get great image quality, great image stabilization, and great autofocusing. And in emergency situations, you could even put a 1.4 extender on that lens as well and still get reasonable results, even though, like with all teleconverters, I wouldn't recommend using them all the time. So when it comes to ultimate image quality, focusing speed, and sharpness, a prime lens usually shines, like the 4.5 400mm lens. But when it comes to versatility and flexibility, a lens like the 100 to 400mm lens definitely has a bit of an edge. Talking about that flexibility, Nikon has another interesting lens in their lineup that lets you zoom from 180 all the way to 600mm. And I know many people looking at the 4.5 400mm lens probably also consider the 180 to 600mm lens, especially because it has that added flexibility and also costs a lot less. At the same time, we have to remember that there's a reason for the price difference. The 4.5 400mm lens is a top-of-the-line S-line lens with the best coatings that give us super good image quality, nice and fast autofocus, and great image stabilization. The 180 to 600mm lens is definitely no slouch in that regard, and you get some amazing images with that lens, but you have to keep in mind that the top-of-the-line S-line lenses, especially the prime ones, will definitely outperform it in certain areas. That aside, the biggest downside of the 180 to 600mm lens is probably its size and its weight, which is significantly more than the 4.5 400mm lens. You might wonder what the image quality would be like with the 4.5 400mm lens and the 1.4 extender compared to the 180 to 600mm lens at 560 or 600mm. Overall, I think the image quality of the 4.5 400mm lens with the 1.4 extender and the 180 to 600mm lens at around 600mm is fairly similar, especially if you stop down that 180 to 600mm lens to about 1 stop. Wide open, I'd still give an edge to the prime lens, where stop down, I think the lenses become fairly similar. And oftentimes then in the field, there's other factors that influence image quality more than the difference between these two lenses. Which lens will be the best one for you largely depends on your use case. If you love flexibility and versatility, take some emergency macro shots, like to zoom out, like to zoom in, and maybe sometimes use a teleconverter, then the 100 to 400mm lens would be an excellent choice for you. If you know that 400mm is the perfect focal length to you and you want a lens with amazing image quality, super fast autofocus and great image stabilization that also hardly weighs anything, much lighter than most other lenses, then this 4.5 400mm lens is basically a no-brainer for you. However, if you need more reach and plan to use this lens with a teleconverter all the time, there may be some other lenses that are better suited to you, because I would never buy a lens with the intention to use it with a teleconverter all the time. So in that case, Nikon has some amazing other offerings like the 600mm PF lens or the 800mm PF lenses that will probably make you more happy long term, because ultimately if you know that you're using a lens with a teleconverter all the time, your base lens is basically too short because you always have to extend it with the teleconverter, and then buying a longer lens will make you more happy long term. So if this lens is going to be your main go-to lens, you're going to use it for birds in flight, large animals and some action photography, I'm sure you will be very happy with it. Whereas if you know that you shoot some small subject, use the teleconverter a lot, or also want to take some wider shots, there's probably some other lenses in the lineup that are slightly better suited for you. Personally, this lens has definitely convinced me in the field with its performance and the super fast autofocus, good image quality and great image stabilization. It's probably not one that would find its way into my bag because I simply like other lenses more in that range, like 100 to 400mm lens for instance, and also because I already have a big 600mm prime lens. So as a secondary lens, I often prefer a more flexible zoom lens rather than another prime lens. That's not saying that I don't like the 4.5 400mm for instance, but my shooting style is better suited with a combination of like a 100 to 400mm lens and then a 600 or 800mm lens. What are your thoughts on the 400mm range? Are you going for the 4.5 400mm lens? Is that a lens that you're interested in? Or are you loving other lenses like the 180 to 600mm lens, the 100 to 400mm lens, 600 PF, 600 TC, 800 PF? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, also hit that like button, check out my channel membership and hit that subscribe button, and I will see you guys in another video very soon. Bye!